We.
Even over niet eten, sorry hoor, ik merk dat. Intentie. En dan weer achterover natuurlijk, dat is scherp. Even bij.
I think that, in fact, the true living traditions in science, in art, and in spirituality have never been separated because they have the common source, in fact, which is the kinds of sources we referred to before of being able to let go of whatever it is you were holding on tight and then jump into a moment of insight and freedom, of letting your fixed mind become unfixed. All three of those activities, like any human creative commonsensical activity, share that letting fixated mind get unfixed. So from that point of view, they have never been separated. Now, it is true that there is this more superficial, more acquired habits or tendencies to see one as opposed to or as completely stuck on one line or another. And therefore, this kind of initiatives, or people who constantly remind us of that, is always needed and is always welcome. I think that we should therefore praise this kind of initiative and really continue to bring that into our own awareness. At the same time of praising that kind of initiative, I would like to warn us all of the possible danger of believing that we're now at a moment where we can bring in a transformation and putting these things together because it is going to be a unique historical time. I don't think so. It is the dream of what used to be in the 60s, the dream of the New Age. I don't think that is healthy to continue to hold on to the myth that we are about to come into some major transformation. So with the real work is steady, slow, and permanent. I was born and raised in a small village in the mountains where there was a very different form of life. It wasn't at all post-industrial life. It was, if anything, very pre-industrial life. And it was like life has been in humanity in the West for 3, 4, 5 centuries until the industrial age, in a small village with a very large community of family and with very different kind of solidarity values and respect for nature, and very simple. It was small peasants. So I was very marked by that kind of experience of a world which was very communal and very simple in many ways. Then I went to the big city and did my school and university at the beginning of my training. And that was probably the second major influence, was that I ran into somebody who was first my teacher and then became my colleague, somebody from whom I've learned a lot and with whom we have done a number of things, which is Umberto Maturana, a very well-known neurophysiologist, even when I met him. That was in the early 60s, we're talking about, 64 to be precise. I arrived at his lab one day when I was 18. I was 18, so I was just beginning the university, second year university. And I said, I know you are interested in working with the brain, and I'm also perhaps interested in coming to work with you. And he said, he looked at me and he said, well, maybe, but what are you really interested in? And just completely spontaneously, without thinking about it, I said, oh, I'm interested in the psyche of the universe. And he was taken aback for a moment, and he said, oh, in that case, you have come to the right place, my boy. So that happened in Chile. And then the third major influence is, as you can imagine, when I finished my doctorate, I went out to the United States, I did my doctorate, and decided to return when the socialist regime of Allende was elected. Actually, I arrived 2 days before. And I did go back because I wanted to be part of that, because I had that kind of vision that many of us shared then, that we could do something to build up.
The compassionate society was already...
Not to separate my scientific work from what was around me. The most interesting part of cognition, which is two things that I touched on very quickly before. One, the fact that whatever it is that we know, it is not separate from what we do to know it. There is that inseparability between knower and known, which is not at all what happens when you have an engineering perspective, where the machine is supposed to know what you give it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And second of all, because the question of creativity is key. That is, for an animal, for a living being to have a world, it's something that he actually shapes and creates over evolution and in its own history. It is not something that is given. So these two questions are fundamental and unique to living beings. In that sense, biology holds the key to the understanding of cognition. I'm completely convinced of that. And I think that the field is slowly recognizing that. An example, you have just to look at the new trends even in the engineering-oriented artificial intelligence to realize that many people are beginning to turn around to say, interesting, what we thought it was the hardest is in fact the simplest, and vice versa. What we thought it was the simplest is the hardest. What is the simplest, for example, is the fact that you can have a little tiny insect that flies around the room without bumping onto a wall. Tiny little thing. There's no human device that can do that. And people in artificial intelligence are beginning to say, these very simple living things can do something that it is so profound that that's where we have to look to understand what is truly intelligence. Yeah. Right? While in the early 60s, the idea was that true intelligence was proving theorems and doing deductions. So all the effort went into building a machine that was like a gigantic reasoner, again with the notion, rationalistic tradition, that mind is logic, is deduction, is inference, is mostly about logical rules. In fact, to me, and I think, again, this is beginning to be appreciated even by the engineers, mind and cognition is fundamentally about being embodied into actions in the world. Very simple sensory motor tasks are absolutely key. I would say that one of the bases of life, one that I have been very interested in, it is its capacity to actually to self-produce itself. That is, to come up by its own activity. And that is one of the sources of the creativity. You can trace that even to the early origin of life, because the very moment of the start of life in this notion of self-production of autopoiesis that we introduced with Maturana some years ago is precisely that life begins at the moment when something produces something which is not different from the process that is producing itself. It's completely closed as self-producing means, and that is a cell. A cell is something that produces a boundary, and a boundary that allows the boundary-producing reactions to exist. So it's a completely self-bootstrapping unit. And that, at that moment, you have the beginning of this autonomy that is proper to life. If we go back to what we were mentioning before, that knowledge is not, as we're used to believe, just an apprehension of the world out there, where you just fall in and then you take it in and you make a model, right? You process the information that the environment gives you. But in fact, that being in a world is a long process of co-evolution or co-definition between outside and inside. That means that the question is open of whether this way of bringing forth a world, as I like to say, is unique or there are multiple ones, right? For example, in the laboratory, this is one of the things that I study, is the world of colors and color vision, for a very good reason, which is that color is a very beautiful case study for this multiversality, because the way you and I, primates, see what we call color is not at all the way other species see it. You see, it's easy for human beings to understand that different cultures have a different view of what, say, beauty or justice is. And we have no problems in accepting that we live in a multiverse of social constructs. What I'm trying to show with this research not just me, it's a few other people. I mean, this is not just my own trip, but that you can try and attempt to show with this line of research, is that this multiversality carries on all the way down to how you feel, how you perceive. That when you see a color, which is identical for all human beings, there is completely cross-cultural. Nevertheless, that is proper to humans. Now, the proper cross-cultural comparison is between humans and birds and fishes and insects. Because each one of these groups have something that is proper to call color vision, but is so different from ours that it cannot be accounted for as just another view of the same thing out there. It's in fact a different world, it's incommensurably different. For example, birds happen to have a different dimension in their color space. Now, that's a little technical, but the idea is that their colors is as diverse as ours, as we would be to a flat creature, to a creature that has only two dimensions. The third dimension in space is inconceivable for a flat creature. Now, birds, mind you, have another dimension of color. That is, it's not that they see more colors. It's not that they see better colors. It's that their color space is unimaginable for us. So that is again an example of another way of laying down a path for this stream of living things, which then gives them a world which we share, but at the same time it cannot be uniquely assigned as being theirs is the true one, ours is the false one, or vice versa. It is truly a multiverse. Now, that to me is one of the most fascinating concepts, I agree, because it says that when you walk around in the street, and I can see there the pigeons, and there's dogs walking about, and we are walking about, and children. Dogs happen to have a very simple color space. They are dichromats. We are trichromats, and the birds are probably even pentachromats. That's dimensionality grows up. Yet we're all walking around the canal there. We're all sharing something we can call a common ground. But this common ground is not something that it is pre-given. Each one of us has actually made it into a proper world. It's a multiversality. So ground is a very feminine quality of making something possible, instead of being a very masculine quality of the out there that you have to fit into. You see? Now, in the Buddhist tradition, which is one of the reasons I'm so interested in it, is that the Buddhist tradition had made its own discovery of this groundless nature of human reality, that you cannot rely on some absolute truth or absolute judgment, that every form of knowing or every form of ignorance is contextual. The interesting thing about the Buddhist tradition is that they warn you from the very beginning that if you don't pay attention, if you don't have a profound work on what is it for you in your life to confront that lack of foundation, you're going to fall into the pitfall of that nihilism, which is exactly the kind of pitfall that Heidegger fell into. So what it comes down to, and this is a long-winded answer to come to a very simple point, is that confronting this lack of foundation immediately makes it essential and points to the need for a human practice, for a human learning, for a human transformation into that. It is not enough to know it. It is not enough to understand it. It is not to have a scientific theory of it. You have to grow into it. Spontaneously, human beings do not know how to handle that. That's basically the message of the Buddhist tradition, is to say, you're already pretty well off if you understand that and you recognize it. But that is nothing compared to the need to understand the immaturity with which we are born to confront it, because maniacally we want to solidify things, maniacally. So when you understand that you have no ground and yet you are maniacally solidifying it, you begin to lead a life that is completely strange, and that leads into that deviation of the Heideggerian style. And I really believe that that was what he was prey of. He understood he didn't have a way of growing into it by a standard, steady practice. Now, when I mean a practice, I mean a means of learning. The Buddhist tradition offers one, which is meditation practice. I'm not saying that that is the cure for all. That would be silly. But that is a practice. In the West, you can say that, for example, a psychoanalysis well understood is another form of practice. And we can certainly point to others. Each one of these human practices points to the need to that kind of learning into groundlessness. It doesn't come about automatically. So if I were to give a definition of spirituality, that would be that, it for me. It is growing into the need for that practice and actually carrying it out, however best you can, but actually coming to grips with that need. At a point when in your own process of minding, of awareness, there's a point where you let go of something and let something else come up. That there is precisely that discontinuity. Normally when we look at our mind, we have the feeling that there is great continuity, that it's a solid thing. But the creative process, and for that matter, the spiritual process, is partly, I think, a learning to be much more light touch about what is happening in your mind, so that there's a moment when you can just plop, let go, literally put it down, drop it. And at that moment, there is like a break. There is like a discontinuity, a gap. And within that gap, there is that open ground, which is, if you want to call it, being with a capital B. And out of that, there is the eternal source of novelty and insight. In fact, insight is something that happens at that point of juncture, of discontinuity. That's something, by the way, that in the practice of meditation one does see very, very precisely. But artists know this very well too. People always say, relax your mind. Don't manipulate your state of mind. If you want to be really do something well, you cannot really be in control. You have to let go, put down. And of course, love is the greatest moment when that happens, because you actually put down things and you let yourself be touched. But usually in love is by the other. And the creative process is more by the sources of one's mind. When we grow up and we constitute this it we call me, this self we call Francisco, whatever, that happens not just inside of my skull. It is not that my mind is here, because it happens among human beings as a constant process of exchange in language. So we actually emerge or arise within language. Now, language doesn't belong to me or to you, to anybody. Language, in fact, exists like air. It is a medium where we all actually exist. And it is not that we actually learn language, it's more that language learns us. Any of the form of senses is a way of bringing forth part of your world. And the fact that you see in 3 dimensions and in these kinds of colors, it is a way of obscuring. It's not a way of knowing. It's a way of obscuring because you think that that is really there. And in fact, vision is the most trompe-l'œil that you can imagine, because it gives you the impression that it's far away, that you couldn't possibly have anything to do with what is out there in space. But yet, the quality of space is inseparable from the way we're constituted. See? So in that sense, vision is the most tricky of all the senses. While the more closest senses, like touching, they do actually convey in themselves a notion of intimacy. But there is, of course, the other dimension of how vision is a world where you can convey this artistic quality of vision, or like in any other sense, like music. But then we come back to the question of art, that when a visual image communicates, it's because it accomplishes that artistic step, which is to clack, make you stop. When you say, there is that moment of discontinuity. That is proper to all of the sensation. It's harder to do it with smell, but a good cook can do that.
True.
The musicians do, and the people who dance or who can give you a good massage do it in the kinesthetic mode. But I don't see the visual communication as being intrinsically more powerful that way. Look, why do you ask?